Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Chapter 10 in our History of International Politics lectures. We will have a look today at the international order, the normative dimension of the international order during the Cold War period, that is to say, from 45 to 89-91. This period was characterized by the rise of the creation of the United Nations by the major winner of World War II, that is to say, the United States of America, but also by kind of ideological struggle opposing the so-called free world of the West to the communist bloc, considered to be synonymous with totalitarianism by Western states in general and by the United States more specifically. We saw in our first part that the US, materially speaking, became a significant power, and even the preeminent power as early as in the 1870s under Ulysses Grant's presidency. The US, however, at that time practiced what Zakaria calls an imperial understretch, that is to say, it had no worldwide ambitions in general terms, with some exceptions. We will come back to this. It stuck to its isolationist tradition. And things changed partly after World War I and during the interwar period. Why? Because Woodrow Wilson, the president in 1918, who had decided that America should join World War I, Woodrow Wilson was eager to propose a new post-World War I order based on liberal values. His liberal vision of international politics indeed ascribed the outbreak of World War I and wars in general to autocratic regimes. And since he was eager, I quote one of his speeches, to make the world safe for democracy, he imagined various reforms of the international order in order for peace and democracy to prevail. In his 14 points speech held in January 1918, he wanted to get rid of arms races. He wanted to replace secret diplomacy by open or public diplomacy. He wanted to put an end to protectionism thanks to free trade and navigation on free navigation on the seven seas. He wanted also the colonial powers to put an end to their imperialist practices overseas. And last but not least, in the concrete domain of war and peace, he wanted to create an association of nations in order to replace the traditional balance of power strategy by the respective international law. And the aim of this League of Nations, which was the first effort, the first attempt to institutionalize a collective security system, the aim of this League of Nations was to achieve international peace and security by the acceptance of all the member states, not to resort to war. The member states of the League of Nations agreed in rejecting violent means as normal means of foreign policy. They committed themselves to preserve the political independence, to respect the political independence of all the states. That is to say, they promised not to resort to war. This League of Nations was complemented in 1937 by a pact which was called the Decalogue, a pact, the general treaty for renunciation of war as an instrument of national policy. The aim was to favor peaceful settlement of disputes, and this idea had been put forward by Wilson. Wilson, however, was unable to convince the majority of the Senate, the US Senate, to ratify the Versailles Treaty, which included this League of Nations charter. So the League of Nations ended up being a failure. We saw this in our first part too. It ended up being a failure for different reasons, but if you accept my power cycle framework, it was a failure first and foremost because the US itself, being the new materially preeminent power, did not participate, was not a participant, was not a member state of the League of Nations. The Senate refused to ratify the Versailles Treaty. It was eager to go on maintaining America's traditional isolationist foreign policy. So the US had to wait until 1945 before grasping the opportunity that will be offered to them by their victory in World War II, before grasping the opportunity to propose a new international order, that is to say, to grasp the opportunity to regulate the international society, thanks mainly to the creation of the successor organization to the League of Nations, that is to say, the United Nations organization. You know that the United Nations Charter was signed in San Francisco, no longer Geneva. This gives us an idea, of course, of the geographical shift of the core of the post-World War II international society, located now in the US and no more in Europe. Europe was no more dominating the world politics, and therefore the international society will no longer be European-centered, as had been the case in previous centuries, that is to say from 1648, or to some extent from 1492 to the end of World War II. The United Nations were created by the United States of America, and the United Nations is a kind of compromise between America's basically liberal or idealist vision of international politics on the one hand, and America's progressively realist practice of international politics. And in order to understand this tension and the potential contradictions that are the consequences of this tension, I think we have to go back to the foreign policy vision held by the founding fathers of America at the end of the 18th century. We have to go back to these foreign policy visions, and we also have to go back to the first encounters, the historical roots of America's encounter with international politics. And I will here apply Michael Hunt's ideology and US foreign policy on the one hand, and I also will use Walter McDougall's Promised Land and Crusader State is the title of his book. The visions on the one hand, the first encounter of America with the world, notably beyond the Western Hemisphere, explain that on the one hand, America was indeed different from the European powers, at least in its dealing with the then European powers. And being different and perceiving itself to be different, America adopted a liberal vision, which goes back to the values, the spirit of Protestantism, American exceptionalism. The US perceived itself to be un-Europe due to the values of the Pilgrim Fathers that had crossed the Atlantic Ocean. But on the other hand, the more and more the US became rich and therefore powerful, at least potentially, latently, the more it became tempted to adopt a traditional, that is to say, a realist policy, foreign policy, similar to the one of the European major powers when it dealt with the outside world. And this is somehow normal if we agree in saying that rising powers acquire more and more economic resources and therefore also more and more military strength, and therefore somehow logically their ambitions grow. So let's have a look in details at the foreign policy doctrines or ideologies or debates that characterized the US when it became independent. That is to say, in the last 2 decades and a half of the 18th century, America's political regime was inspired by John Locke's liberal philosophy, the separation between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary power. The US wanted to be anything but a monarchy, since it got rid of the British colonial presence, and Great Britain was monarchy. This consensus did not exist in the domain of foreign policy. How should America behave on the international scene? And the founding fathers actually were divided. They were torn between two diverging visions and therefore diplomatic guidelines proposed on the one hand by Alexander Hamilton and on the other hand by Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton first, one of the three Federalists, one of the three authors of the so-called Federalist Papers, favorable to America becoming a federation. This happened in 1787 when the 13 former British colonies that had become independent in 1776 accepted the Constitution, the Federal Constitution. Alexander Hamilton was a realist. That is to say, he considered international politics to be synonymous with a never-ending state of war. And he was convinced that the US sooner or later would get involved in the quarrels opposing the then still European major powers. Remember that the British were present, that the French had been present in Quebec up to their defeat in 1763, or 7 years more, that the Mexicans still controlled, of course, Latin America, Central America, and even the southern part of the US from Florida to California. So given these European powers and their presence on the American continent, Hamilton was persuaded that it would be useless for America to try to escape this conflict. So what should the US do? It should first and foremost consolidate its own power base. That is to say, notably, it should consolidate its economic richness in order, in a second time, to cope successfully with the lack of restraint characterizing the major European powers. And what's more, if America should choose one ally, it should choose the UK, Great Britain, and not France, though France had contributed to America's independence. Why? Because Hamilton considered that France, I quote, was guided by a spirit of universal domination. And this distinguished it, according to him, from the British. So it was in the interest of the US to opt for an alliance with Great Britain, which was a lesser evil, I quote Hamilton once again. The fact, of course, to betray the French alliance, the French coalition, the French-American coalition that had permitted the US to become independent, is a typical realist stance. According to realists, there are no eternal allies, there are no perpetual enemies, there are only national interests. And according to Hamilton, the national interest consists in establishing an alliance with the British, thus, despite the French having permitted America to become independent. So Hamilton was a realist. Jefferson was an idealist. Thomas Jefferson, though he was not sure that war could be abolished, definitely, nevertheless, was convinced that what Thomas Hobbes had called the disposition to go to war could be lessened. Why? How? By improving the mind and the morals of society. That is to say, the US should adopt, thanks to its exceptionalism, should adopt a foreign policy guided by national interests, defined in terms of moral duties and not in terms of material interests, as emphasized by Hamilton. And very concretely, this meant that the US should remain aloof from European affairs. It should isolate itself from the European powers' foreign policy. And this, according to him, would be possible thanks to, I quote, the white ocean, separating the US from the European powers, to stand aloof, to adopt an isolationist foreign policy. So a debate among American founding fathers, and the compromise between the two visions was found by America's first president, George Washington. He found a compromise which he announced in his famous farewell address. In this address, what did he say? He recommended to his fellow citizens that America, I quote, should have as little political connection as possible, as little political connection as possible with foreign nations, of course, while at the same time, I quote again, extending commercial relations, as little political relations as possible, as much trade as possible. I go on quoting the motivations of his proposal. Europe, he said, has a set of primary interests which to us have none or only a very remote relation. Hence, it would be unwise for America to implicate itself by artificial ties in Europe's policy. It would be unwise to implicate, America would be unwise to implicate itself in Europe's politics. Our detached and distant situation, geographically speaking, invites us and enables us to pursue a different course, to adopt a different foreign policy from the power political game played by the European powers. Why, I go on quoting, why forego the advantages of our peculiar situation? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalry, interest, humor, or caprice? We should not entangle our prosperity and our security or our peace by having too close connections with Europe. And he then sums up his recommendation. It is our true policy to steer clear of any permanent alliances, to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world, as far as we are at liberty. We may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. No permanent alliance, no entangling alliance. America should not commit itself on the international political stage by becoming an ally, a permanent ally of whatever European power. And you may know that it is as late as 1949, with the creation of the Northern Treaty Organization, that the US, for the very first time, so more than 150 years after George Washington's farewell address, that the US abandoned this recommendation, no entangling alliance. So George Washington announced what will be America's foreign policy tradition throughout the 19th century: isolationism. This isolationism, of course, can be ascribed to two different reasons. It can be ascribed to, and this is what Americans somehow spontaneously do in their presentation, in their own presentation of their foreign policy. It can be ascribed to the ethics to the logic of ethics, of morality, of identity. This is to Jefferson's point of view. We refuse to intervene in Europe. We are exceptional, we are the city upon the hill, we are the beacon of humanity, and therefore we behave differently, and we will not commit ourselves in power political games. But it can also be ascribed, of course, to a more down-to-earth logic, the logic of interest of Alexander Hamilton. George Washington was smart enough, of course, to understand that at that time America was too weak compared to American power. So it had an interest in not committing itself in the European rivalries, because it would run the risk of being defeated. And you may know that as late as 1812, an American-British war ended up in Washington being burnt down by the British. The issue at stake was Canada's independence, which which was not possible. Canada remained a British dominion. Whatever the interpretation is, America's isolationism due to Jefferson's ideal, or is it due to Hamilton's interests? Anyway, whatever the interpretation, I think we can come to the conclusion that when America dealt with the outside world, it claimed to be different from European powers. It claimed to be different from the power political practices of the European powers. America claimed to be different, and to some extent, it did indeed behave differently. First of all, three points here. First of all, it had become independent thanks to the so-called American Revolution, that is to say, to its war of independence against the British colonial presence. So it was the first non-European unit to emancipate itself from Europe. And by definition, this proves that it was indeed different. Second difference, in 1823, the Latin American colonies of Spain launched their own war of independence. And Spain was tempted to appeal to the Holy Alliance. The Holy Alliance aim of the Holy Alliance, we know that, was to maintain the existing order. It intervened, we saw this last week, in Hungary, in Poland, in Spain, in Italy. So Spain came to the conclusion that it might intervene. The Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians could send troops, maybe the French could send troops in Latin America in order to maintain the Spanish order against Simon Bolivar, the most important, the most representative independence fighter of Latin America. In order to cope with this threat, or this possibility of European troops landing in the Western Hemisphere, the Americans adopted the famous Monroe Doctrine, named after the President James Monroe, who announced it in 1823. And for the first time, we have a non-European power refusing to submit to Europe, refusing to accept the conception shared by the Europeans, according to which the Europeans had the right to do what they were eager to do anywhere in the world. So the Monroe Doctrine is a defensive doctrine. It contains potentially offensive or imperialist elements. We'll come back to this, but at the very beginning, given the then context characterized by the eagerness of the Europeans, or some Europeans, to intervene in the Western Hemisphere, it is basically a defensive doctrine. Listen to the Monroe Doctrine. In the wars of European powers, we have never taken any part. We Americans never intervened in the wars of European powers, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. In 1823, the Greeks were eager to become independent from the Ottoman Empire. They managed to do so. The US, the allusion of Monroe is to the Greek War of Independence. We do not have the intention to intervene in the wars of the European powers. And then he announces what America is likely to do in the case of Europeans intervening in the Western Hemisphere. It is only when our rights are invaded or seriously threatened that we resent injuries or make preparation for our defense. It is only when our rights are invaded that we will be ready to defend ourselves. With the movements in this hemisphere, the Western American hemisphere, we are of necessity immediately connected geographically. The US is contiguous, of course, to Mexico and South America. With the movements in this hemisphere, we are of necessity immediately connected. We therefore declare that we should consider any attempt on the part of the Europeans to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere. We declare that such an attempt would be dangerous to our safety and to our liberty. If Europeans intervene, we will feel threatened. With the existing colonies of this hemisphere, with the existing colonies of any, with the existing colonies of any European power, we have not interfered, and we shall not interfere. So we shall not interfere in Europe. But with the governments who have declared their independence in Latin America and maintain it, and whose independence we Americans have acknowledged, we cannot view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling them by any European power as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. If European powers intervened, this will be considered as an unfriendly move by the US, and the US therefore will be ready to defend itself and to defend the independence of those Latin American, those Spanish American colonies that were about to become genuinely independent. So for the first time, a non-European power was able to tell the Europeans, stop, don't go further. We will refuse your intervention. In the Western Hemisphere, the US is different from the European powers. And the third empirical indicator of America being different is that the US was the first state to recognize the independence of an African state, Liberia, created in 1847 by former American slaves, Black American slaves that had been set free by an American philanthropic society that had sailed back to Africa and settled down in a territory that they called themselves Liberia. Liberia in the West, and on the other hand, Ethiopia, were during the 19th century, during the so-called scramble for Africa, the two only African territories that were not colonized by Europeans. Ethiopia or Abyssinia will be by fascist Italy in the 1920s. So America obviously is different, at least to some extent. And to say that it is to some extent different amounts to saying that it's not completely different. It's not totally different. That is to say, America is a bit ambiguous, or was ambiguous. Despite its isolationism, it shared some practices. It adopted some practices that it shared with the European powers. And to quote Teddy Roosevelt, the American president at the very beginning of the 20th century, it spoke softly, but it carried a big stick when speaking softly, very concretely. First of all, Americans had conquered, we saw this in our previous chapters, it had conquered its own Wild West, from the Great Plains west of the Mississippi River to California, Oregon, to the Pacific coast. It had conquered this Wild West, yes, by annihilating almost completely the native Indian Americans, by battles, by diseases, by forcing the Indians to live in reservations. And according to Michael Hunt, he relies on historical studies, there were 10 million Indians living in North America when the first Pilgrim Fathers arrived in New England and in Virginia at the beginning of the 17th century. 10 million. In the 1930s, so roughly 300 years later, there were only 300,000 Indians in North America, north of the Rio Grande in today's the US and in today's Canada. From 10 million to 300,000. We saw in our last chapter that the Europeans, or in our chapter 8, that the Europeans justified their conquests with the term terra nullius, the land belongs to nobody, so it's empty. Actually, I quote once again Michael Hunt, it is the Americans that emptied the territories of North America. It was not empty. It was emptied by the Americans. And I would like to quote General Sherman, one of the two generals permitting the northern US states to win against the southern states during the American Civil War, the War of Secession. This is what he wrote in 1868. The more Indians we can kill this year, the less will have to be killed next year. The more I see Indians, the more I am convinced that they all have to be killed. General Sherman, together with General Grant, those who won the War of Secession against General Lee. General Lee enslaved and his Southern American citizens, fellow citizens, Southern states, Virginia, Georgia, Texas, etc., enslaved the blacks. All Americans, all white Americans killed Indians. America also had expanded westward and southward by waging wars against Mexico from Florida to California. Secondly, regarding very concretely the big stick policy of America towards North America, of the US towards Latin America, the Monroe Doctrine was complemented at the beginning of the 20th century by the so-called Roosevelt Corollary, to the Monroe Doctrine, named after Theodore Roosevelt. And very concretely, this new version of the Monroe Doctrine turned Latin America to what we may call the United States backyard. That is to say, the US claimed that it had the right to interfere in Latin American affairs as soon as it considered its interests, strategic, but maybe first and foremost economic, as to say, private interests, when it perceived these interests to be threatened by what happened within Latin American states, Latin American societies, which had become independent in the 1820s. Listen to this Roosevelt Corollary. All that this country, the US, desires is to see the neighboring states in the south of the Rio Grande. All what America desires is to see these countries stable, orderly, and prosperous. Any country in the south, in South America, whose people conduct themselves well, can count upon our friendship. If a nation shows that it knows how to act with reasonable efficiency and decency in social and political matters, if it keeps order, if it pays its obligation, it needs to fear no interference from the US. The US will not interfere as long as everything is stable in Latin America. However, chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society may in America, as elsewhere, we will act as elsewhere, as the Europeans, may in America, as elsewhere, require intervention. So if everything is wrong, if anything, is going wrong in South America, we America have the right to intervene, require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the US may, however reluctantly, exercise an international police power in the case of wrongdoing. However reluctantly. It's very interesting to see how imperialist powers, because when dealing with South America, the US indeed practiced an imperialist policy. It is very interesting to see how imperialist powers always claim to act reluctantly in order to justify as a defensive policy what actually, of course, is an offensive policy. So the US, according to Teddy Roosevelt, claims that it has a right to intervene in order to maintain civilization. It's exactly the same argument as the one put forward by the British and other European powers when they spread their standard of civilization. Intervention is legitimate when a civilized nation intervenes in order to permit civilization to survive when civilization is threatened because of the wrongdoing of less civilized nations. And last but not least, the US also practiced the same gunboat diplomacy. We saw this last week when it joined the European powers, forcing China and Japan to open their doors to American merchants and to American missionaries. America had even some imperial ambitions beyond the Western Hemisphere. In the Western Hemisphere, of course, McKinley in Cuba, 1898, Roosevelt himself in the zone of the Panama Canal, and McKinley also intervened in the Philippines to get rid of the Spaniards, in Hawaii, in other islands in the midst of the Pacific Ocean. And the arguments put forward were once again the same as the Europeans. Listen to Americans justifying their intervention in the Philippines. The taking of the Philippines will spread civilization among a people who has never known liberty. We will spread liberty. The US can give to those people a larger measure of peace and happiness, of freedom and prosperity than any other nation in the world. We are better equipped than the Spaniards to permit the Philippines to be free. The US must not fail in its duty. There is a duty to spread freedom. Exactly the same argumentation as the white man's burden, exactly the same argumentation that will be put forward. We'll come back to this in 2 chapters or in 1 chapter. It's exactly the same argumentation justifying America's 20-year-long presence in Afghanistan. We have to permit Afghanistan, the Afghani people, to become free, to remain free. So the Americans at the beginning and throughout the 19th century were torn between two visions of foreign policy and two practices of foreign policy. How did this somehow a contradictory attitude evolve? Well, as usual, major powers, once they resort to power political practices, despite their origins, end up justifying these power political practices in liberal or idealist terms, in order, of course, to justify what they are doing, since what they are doing somehow contradicts their proclaimed ambitions, their proclaimed objectives. To quote John Mearsheimer's book, published 2 or 3 years ago, The Great Delusion, liberal great powers, that is to say, those who claim to be liberal and to some extent are liberal in their domestic regime, of course, liberal great powers talk like liberals, but act like realists on the international scene. And this is perfectly the case for the US throughout the Cold War period. The Cold War period will be characterized by the creation of the UN regarding the international society perspective, and the United Nations, this post-World War II order had been prepared and to some extent already announced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president during World War II, announced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1942 in his Atlantic Charter that he signed together with America's major Western ally, that is to say, Winston Churchill. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's aim was to promote and to make possible the Wilsonian ideal of a liberal democratic post-World War II order, based on the principles, of course, of freedom, of self-determination in domestic affairs, based on free trade and the abandonment of the use of force in international affairs. This was the aim of the Atlantic Charter in 1942, but in 1945, the US was not the only winner of World War II. The Soviets also belonged to the victorious powers, and the USSR had its own communist vision of what the international order, the post-45 order, should consist of. So Roosevelt, because of this power political rivalry we saw in our first parts, Roosevelt was led to give up this ideal world order. He had to abandon the hope to convert the whole world to democracy. What then did he do? He found a kind of compromise that he summed up in his phrase, one world, 4 policemen. One world, 4 policemen. And this phrase perfectly illustrates the mixture of liberal or ideal politic on the one hand and real politic on the other hand, which characterizes the United Nations. Ideal politic or liberal politic, because it considers the world to be one universal society, one international society, despite the division in different independent sovereign units. And of course, what's more, these states do commit themselves to respect peace. They promise to abandon any use and even the threat of the use of force. This is the multilateral dimension of the United Nations. All the nations, members of the United Nations, promise not to go to war anymore. So this is typical of liberal or idealist visions of international policy. But one world, 4 policemen. 4 policemen who became 5 when France was admitted as the 5th permanent member of the UN Security Council. These 5 policemen, these 5 permanent members, have a special privilege to do what? Well, to adopt those measures that will permit this international peace and this international security to prevail in concrete terms whenever one state does not maintain its promise. And of course, this UN Security Council is the concrete illustration of what we saw last week of Jerry Simpson's legalized hegemony principle. That is to say, the UN Security Council grants to the 5 permanent members a special status, special privileges. They can afford not to respect those rules that they impose upon the other states. Let's have a little close look, ladies and gentlemen, at the United Nations, its charter, and how this charter was or not put into practice throughout the Cold War period. The United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, embodied, at least throughout the Cold War, things will again evolve after the end of the Cold War. We'll come back to this next week. The UN embodied throughout the Cold War a fairly pluralist international society, and maybe actually should I say the very first genuinely pluralist international society. Thanks to the existing power distribution, the US could not impose its will upon the USSR, its vision upon the USSR. The US itself somehow was different. We saw this from the European powers, and these European powers, of course, had been weakened, had been exhausted by World War I and also by World War II. Even the British, though they belonged to the winners of World War I and also of World War II. And since the British and the French were no longer what they used to be in the past, they could no more go on imposing their vision of a European-centered international society or of a Christian or solidarist international society. Therefore, the United Nations embodied a fairly pluralist international society. Very concretely, when in the UN was created by I think it was 51 member states. These member states were admitted, whatever their domestic regime, whatever their degree of economic development, whatever their level of civilization. For the first time, the standard of civilization, and I quote Gary Simpson once again, the standard of civilization was abandoned. What was long denied even to states, that is to say, the sovereign equality principle, was now granted to peoples that became independent. The distinction, and this is the point I would like you to remember, in 1945, when the UN was created, the distinction between civilized and non-civilized peoples was abandoned for the first time. No more explicit hierarchy between either Christian and non-Christian, between Europeans and savages, between civilized and non or semi-civilized nations. The distinction between civilized and non-civilized nations or peoples was abandoned, and democracy was not a genuine prerequisite of admission to the Society of States, to the United Nations. The states, be they democratic or not, were admitted, and this explains why the USSR was, of course, one of the founding members of the United Nations. A pluralist international society, and very concretely, this pluralist international society will be explicitly recognized in the UN Charter, Article 2. Article 2.1 first mentions the external dimension of the sovereignty principle. Listen to Article 2.1. The UN organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. No member is superior to any other member in the General Assembly. Article 2.7 refers to the internal dimension of the sovereignty principle. Nothing contained, I quote, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations, that is to say, the members of the United Nations, nothing in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. No interference in the domestic affairs of a state by any other state. And this principle, this internal dimension of the sovereignty principle, will be regularly reaffirmed after 1945, notably in 1960 in the UN Assembly, General Assembly Resolution 1514, relative to the right of self-determination. Former colonies were admitted once they were independent, immediately after their independence, once again, whatever their regime. And this explains that nowadays we have 193 member states, and no longer merely 51 as some 70 to 80 years ago in 1947. Pluralism and just war laws. The just war doctrine, which was conceived of, we saw this 2 weeks ago, by the legal thinkers of the 17th and 18th century, will be put down, written down explicitly in the UN Charter. This was already the case in the League of Nations Charter, but this was a failure. We saw this. The United Nations members indeed do commit themselves not to go to war against any other member state. The aim of the United Nations, when the United Nations were created, the aim was to prevent a new world war from breaking out, and therefore the objective aim, positively stated, was the following one: to live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, to live together in peace, to unite the strength of all the states, to maintain international peace and security, to ensure that armed force shall not be used. These are the aims. This is the aim of the United Nations, much more than economic development or now there is environmental protection, etc., etc. Of course, these aims were added to the original one, but the original one was to maintain international peace and security. And logically, then only defensive wars will be considered to be legal and to be legitimate, that is to say, to be just. Only defensive wars. So let's go into the details. First of all, the general prohibition of wars. Wars in general should no longer be resorted to by member states. Article 2.3, all members shall settle the international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. Peaceful means of conflict resolution. Article 2.4, all members shall refrain in the international relations from the threat or the use of force against any other state, the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. So states should not go to war, but of course, those who drafted the UN Charter, they knew that some states would not keep their promise. So the right to defend oneself will be acknowledged to states. Defensive wars will be legitimate. Article 51 in Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Nothing in the present Charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member state of the United Nations. If a member state of the United Nations, and all the existing states nowadays are members of the United Nations, if a member state, if a nation state, if an independent state is attacked by another, the first state has the right to defend itself. It is the individual or the collective self-defense. It can defend itself if it is strong enough to do so, or it can appeal to all the other members of the United Nations to help it to repel by force the aggressor. So the substantive criterion of the just war doctrine will be explicitly acknowledged in the UN Charter, and the same is true for the formal criterion, what Grotius had called the solemn war criterion. That is to say, the fact for wars to waged by legitimate authorities. Who then is the legitimate authority in today's world since 1945? It is the UN Security Council. Listen to Article 51, the full article. Nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense. States can defend themselves if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until, this is the important point, until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Until, that is to say, a state that has been attacked has the right to defend itself until the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations Security Council takes the measures that it considers to be necessary to reestablish the international peace. So there is a legal hierarchy, favorable to the collective authority, collective authority embodied by the United Security Council, the 5 permanent members plus the 10 non-permanent members, whose authority is to some extent superior to the individual authority of the sovereign states that resorted to war in order to repel an attack by another state. So there is an inherent right benefiting states who can defend themselves, but they, I go on quoting, have to report to the United Security Council the measures that they take. And once the United Security Council intervenes, it is his authority and his responsibility to take, I quote, such action as it deems necessary in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. So every state has the right to defend itself, substantive criterion, but it belongs to the UN Security Council, the formal criterion, to take those measures that are necessary beyond the immediate self-defense of the attacked state. The pluralist conception, ladies and gentlemen, and the just war doctrine, which became a norm, triumphed in 1990, 1991, and during the crisis provoked by Saddam Hussein's invasion and annexation of Kuwait. In order to re-establish the violated sovereignty of Kuwait, in order, to put it differently, to defend the sovereignty principle as the basic norm of the contemporary international society, the United Nations authorized all its members to take all those actions necessary in order to force Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops. George W. Bush, in his speech held on September 11, 1990, that is to say a bit more than 1 month after Iraq's aggression against Kuwait, held his World Order speech, his new World Order speech. This is what he said: out of these troubled times, a new world order can emerge, a world where the rule of law supplants the rule of the jungle to some extent. It is Wilson updated 3 generations after 1919. And this led to the so-called Operation Desert Storm, which started a bit later in January. This Operation Desert Storm itself was adopted on the basis of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. First of all, immediately after the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, August 2, 1990, the Security Council adopted Resolution 660. This resolution determined, I quote, that there was an act of aggression, tantamount to a breach of peace due to the behavior of Iraq. There was an act of aggression. The fact for Iraq to attack offensively Kuwait was an act of aggression. Since it was an offensive and not a defensive war, it was considered, rightly so, on the basis of international law, as an act of aggression, as an unjust war. So the UN Security Council first adopts a resolution determining that such an act of aggression took place, had occurred. A bit later, Resolution 661 decided to take non-violent measures, hoping that these non-violent measures would convince Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops, notably an economic embargo, but also the possibility of member states to deploy defensive troops in the neighboring countries of Iraq and Kuwait, that is to say, first and foremost, in Saudi Arabia. This is what happened. The Americans sent their troops. The operation was called Desert Shield. A shield is defensive. And last but not least, on November 29, 1990, so a bit less than 31 years ago, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 678. This resolution came to the conclusion that the non-violent measures had been unable to compel or to convince, to incite Saddam Hussein to withdraw his troops, and therefore this new resolution, I quote, allowed the United Nations member states to resort to armed violence, to any means, that is to say, to armed violence, in order to re-establish the violated sovereignty of Kuwait. The fact for the United Nations to respect its charter explains that George Herbert Bush, the father, was able to rally a coalition of some 50 states against Iraq, including major Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Syria, which was a rival of Iraq because of ideological divergences within the two regimes, Egypt, Morocco, and of course all the major Western powers contributed to send troops. The troops amounted to 500,000, launching Operation Desert Storm in January 1991, January 18th, as far as I remember, and within 6 weeks, Iraq was defeated and Kuwait's sovereignty was reestablished. Those powers that did not send troops, Japan, for instance, financed with their money the cost of Operation Desert Storm. So this operation was somehow representative of the whole genuine, of the genuine whole international society. 50 states is somehow significant. I also emphasize that China and the USSR still existed, did not oppose their veto to the resolutions. So they implicitly permitted the US and other Western powers and some significant Arab states to launch this operation. And last but not least, this operation re-established the status quo ante, that is to say, it's satisfied with merely forcing Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Iraq. It re-established from Kuwait. It re-established the violated sovereignty of Iraq, but it did not aim at toppling and overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime. This is what George Walker Bush, the son, Jr., will do 13 years later in 2003. We'll come back to this in our next chapter. No regime change, which amounts to saying that Saddam Hussein's regime, an autocratic regime to say the least, was respected to some extent. There was no attempt to get rid of this dictatorship. The pluralist dimension of the international society was respected during this operation. So pluralism, pluralist international, the international society of the Cold War period was a pluralist one, as proven by Operation Desert Storm. But this Operation Desert Storm, though it somehow was the climax of this pluralist conception, was also its only concrete manifestation. Why? Because throughout the Cold War, the UN was paralyzed most of the times. It was paralyzed because of the bipolar rivalry, opposing the US to the USSR, opposing the liberal Western democratic states, the free world, to come back to my title, and the Eastern communist bloc, which amounts to saying, to some extent, that the international society of the Cold War, since it was divided, was a bipolar society. The expression is due to Adam Watson in his evolution of the international society. There was a rivalry opposing the Soviets to the Americans, and yet they agreed upon some rules. Or we could choose the opposite, the reverse presentation. There was an attempt to create a genuine pluralist international society embodied in the UN, but the two major powers interpreted differently the basic principles of this international society. So the society was divided, maybe could we say bipolar. This is how Watson himself sums up his concept. The Cold War was a global struggle, there was a rivalry, but a restrained one. The rift between the two powers was not as great as it is sometimes portrayed. Of course, he makes an allusion to the classical realist analysis of the Cold War being a state of war. No, it was a society, but a divided one, a bipolar one. The two superpowers agreed upon establishing two separate spheres of authority, the East and the West, and they respected each other's sphere of influence. The relations between the two superpowers were chilly, but correct. After the death of Stalin, they explored the possibilities of containing their antagonism. They explored the possibilities of conducting this rivalry in a less expansive and in a less dangerous way, especially by means of a confidential dialogue and by arms limitations agreements. These attempts to moderate the rivalry developed the idea of a wider understanding. So a society, but a bipolar one because of the rivalry. So let's have a look at the details of this somehow ambiguous empirical reality of the Cold War. I said some minutes ago that the United Nations was a kind of compromise between America's eagerness to create a genuinely worldwide liberal democratic world order and the then existing reality of the Soviets refusing, in the part of the world controlled by the Soviets, this liberal democratic order. So since the Americans were somehow forced, despite themselves, to abandon their worldwide order, what did they do? Well, they spread this order among their allies. That's to say, they established a regional, a Western liberal democratic world order. Very concretely, what did they do? They created international institutions where only Western liberal democracies were members. The IMF, the World Bank, and of course the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So the worldwide pluralist international society was complemented, but also challenged to some extent, by a regional solidarist Western society, a Western liberal democratic regional society. And of course, the US considered the Eastern Bloc the communist world to be its rival, to be its adversary, against which the Western values, the Western solidarist conception of the international society should be defended and, if possible, promoted. The USSR was even labeled the evil empire by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And this conception of the USSR as America's enemy went back to the Bolshevik Revolution. As early as in 1917, 1918, the Americans perceived the USSR to be, and communism to be, their enemy. I would like to quote Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State at the very end of World War I, alluding to the then context. There are two great evils, the expression the same as Ronald Reagan will use again. There are two great evils in the world today, 1918. Absolutism, the power of which is waning, an allusion to the autocratic empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary that were about to be defeated in World War I. Absolutism, the power of which is waning, and Bolshevism, the power of which is growing. So ever since 1918, America considered that it was its duty to fight against Bolshevism or communism or the Soviet Union in order first to protect and, if possible, to diffuse liberal and democratic values. So this is what very concretely happened after the end of the American-Soviet coalition that had been created in order to cope with the Soviets and somehow the Japanese threat during World War II. Listen to Harry Truman, the president who was the first Cold War president of the US. We are faced with the most terrible responsibility that a nation ever faced, to save the world from totalitarianism. We must save the world from totalitarianism. The US was the enemy to be confronted, as claimed in the containment doctrine or the Truman doctrine, a doctrine that was conceived of by George Kennan, a US diplomat at the American embassy in Moscow. Listen to this containment doctrine. At the present moment, the world will be divided. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. On the one hand, the will of the majority, distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual property and liberty, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from political oppression. On the other hand, the communist way, the will of the minority, which imposes its will upon the majority, relying upon terror, oppression, a controlled present radio, fixed elections, and no personal freedoms. And according to Truman, in this doctrine, it must be the policy of the US to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by minorities, by the Soviets and their communist allies. Harry Truman, I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. The free peoples of the world look to us, to Americans, for support in maintaining their freedom. Very concretely, what did the Americans do? They resorted to various means in their struggle against the Soviets. Violent means, sometimes overtly violent, as was the case, of course, in the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, launched by Kennedy, but first and foremost, the escalation was due to Lyndon Johnson first and then to Nixon, based on Eisenhower's domino doctrine. The domino doctrine had been adopted during the 50s. It consisted in saying that if one former American ally would become communist, then all its neighbors were running the risk of becoming communists too. And this doctrine was then applied in Vietnam. Vietnam had been a French colony. The French were defeated in 1954. The regime that came to power in North Vietnam was a communist one. It threatened the Western allies, South Vietnam, and therefore the Americans decided to intervene from the 60s onwards. Direct, openly violent actions, but also when fighting against the communists, covered actions by different American presidents in Iran, 1953, in Guatemala, 54, in the Dominican Republic, 65, in Chile, to get rid of Pinochet, 1973, in Nicaragua, in 1985, to fight against Ortega, he who was elected some days ago, once again, a president. A mix of both, sometimes covered actions and openly violent actions, for instance, against Cuba in 1961 during the failed attempt at the Bigs of Pay invasion. The Americans supported also right-wing military dictatorships or other types of illiberal or non-democratic or openly autocratic regimes, notably the apartheid regime in South Africa. The US helped the Taliban, or more generally the Muslim freedom fighters, as they were called by Reagan, against the Soviets, Mujahideen, including those that turned Taliban in the 1990s and that attacked, at least indirectly, the US when supporting Al-Qaeda that staged the 9/11 attacks of 2001. So America, in its fight against the communists, openly supported autocratic regimes. And the justification put forward, because these autocratic regimes, of course, did oppress their own population. There was no freedom for the huge Black majority in South Africa. There was no freedom for the different Latin American populations oppressed by military juntas in Latin America, Brazil, Argentina, temporarily at least, etc., etc. The justification was put forward by Jean Kirkpatrick, the American ambassador at the UN during Ronald Reagan's presidency. She distinguished autocratic from totalitarian regimes. Autocratic regimes were lesser evil and therefore had been supported in America's worldwide fight against the communist totalitarianism. And this justification, to some extent, was updating an infamous phrase due to apparently Franklin Delano Roosevelt talking of the Latin American dictators. He was thinking both of Somoza in Nicaragua and he was thinking of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. This is what Franklin Roosevelt is supposed to have said when he was accused by some critical voices within the US. How can you support these dictators? This is what he said. Listen to this, ladies and gentlemen. He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. He's our son of a bitch, and he permits America to maintain the Western order there where it is threatened by communist guerrillas or communist overtaking. To put it differently, and I would like to quote here the American historian Richard Immerman, America was eager to establish an empire for liberty, much more than an empire of liberty. An empire for liberty, that is to say, it imposed its will upon those populations by supporting the regimes which did oppress their own populations, which did not permit their own populations to be free. So it was, America here was not an empire of liberty, which it was at home. It was an empire for liberty, in order for America to maintain its domination in these parts of the world that it considered to be threatened by the communists. So a society, but a bipolar society, because of the rivalry, the ideological rivalry and America's undertakings. to contain any expansion of the communist world. That said, and this is important, and this comes close to Adam Watson's analysis, the multiplication of American interventions and the multiplication of American-led alliances against the Soviets, the alliances created in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Australian-New Zealand-US Pact, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and the bilateral military alliances with South Korea and Japan remained essentially defensive. America, when dealing directly with the USSR and also the other major communist power at that time, at least during the first half of the Cold War, that is to say China, rejected any explicit rollback strategy, any strategy consisting in trying to liberate those states that were already controlled and occupied by the Soviets. No rollback strategy, only a defensive containment strategy. And by adopting this strategy, the Americans permitted what Khrushchev will call a peaceful coexistence between the two major powers. The Americans paved thus the way to a stabilization of the US-Soviet relationship, mainly after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this stabilization, first and foremost, consisted in the arms control process and later in the disarmament process that was launched as early as in the 50s by Eisenhower, and that was pursued, including by Reagan, despite his evil empire, his evil empire speech. The arms control process and the disarmament process, which started in the 1980s, which permitted a very significant decrease of the nuclear warheads possessed by the two major powers. The American-Soviet learning process, nuclear learning process, ladies and gentlemen, probably was the most striking empirical illustration of the bipolar society. The two agreed, though being divided, upon respecting some rules. And we can add to this first empirical manifestation of the bipolar society the survival of the Potsdam Dialogue. The Potsdam Dialogue, the Potsdam Agreements were adopted in Potsdam at the very end of the World War II. It was relative to the German question. It consisted in agreeing upon the Soviets, the Americans, the British, and the French occupying Germany, the Soviets in the East, the three other ones in the West, of course. And these Potsdam agreements were rediscovered in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. The Potsdam agreements permitted the signature in 1989 of the 2+4 treaty, that is to say the two Germanys plus the four major powers who accepted the Soviet Union, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, who permitted the German reunification and thus the end of the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, ladies and gentlemen, was due, this is what we saw in our first part, to Gorbachev's awareness that, economically speaking, the Soviet Union was too weak to challenge credibly America's preeminence, despite the balance of terror. From a normative point of view, ladies and gentlemen, the end of the Cold War was due to the liberal ideas that entered the mind of some parts of the Eastern populations, the dissidents, thus contributing to undermine the legitimacy of the Soviet or the communist model in Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, in Eastern Germany, in Bulgaria, in Romania, and last but not least, in the Soviet Union itself. and the role of the dissidents and the transnational ideas, that is to say, the liberal ideas, that they promoted against the official Soviet ideology, the role of these dissidents have been made possible, at least indirectly, by the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe that was organized in 1975 in Helsinki, the so-called Helsinki Conference, the capital of Finland, where were adopted, the title of the declaration is the following one: the Declaration on Principles Guiding Relations Between Participating States. The participating states were all the then European states, both East and West, plus the US and Canada. And this declaration adopted 10 principles. Therefore, it's called the Decalogue. The main principles are the following ones: sovereign equality, no use of force, inviolability of frontiers, territorial integrity of states, peaceful settlement of disputes, non-intervention in domestic affairs, cooperation among states, and last but not least, that is the point I would like you to remember, respect for human rights. Respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. I repeat, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of speech, of thought, of conscience, of religion, of belief. That is to say, the various Eastern European countries, the so-called popular democracies from Eastern Germany to the USSR, accepted to sign a declaration where they committed themselves to protect human rights. And those critical voices in these countries that were eager to get rid of the communist regime, or at least to reform it, profited from this principle to put forward their ideas. Sakharov in the USSR, Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, with notably Václav Havel, who became a president of the Czech Republic after the end of the Cold War. Solidarność in Poland profited from this Decalogue to diffuse their ideas among the Polish, the Eastern German, the Soviet, etc., Czechoslovakian population. And in doing so, they contributed, as far as regards the normative or ideological dimension, they contributed to the end of the Cold War, which means also that regarding the normative dimension, the bipolar society of the Cold War, just as the bipolar system in the material dimension was an unequal society. The principles included in the Helsinki Decalogue, the principles included in the Helsinki Declaration, all the principles, and first and foremost, the respect of human rights, are Western values. They express Western, liberal, democratic values, which amounts to saying that in 1975, maybe unconsciously, the Soviets accepted to sign a treaty, a declaration, enshrining Western values and not communist values. To put it differently, the bipolar society was synonymous with at least an implicit normative preeminence of the West in general and the US more particularly. We will have a look next week at how this Western normative preeminence became preeminent, or the more so preeminent, sorry, after the end of the Cold War, when the post-Cold War world will reinvent a new type of solidarist international society called international community. Next week, Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending today's class. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you back again next week. I wish you a great day. Goodbye.